Hello, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching a video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we'll be doing Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. So predominantly I got this information from Plutarch's Lives, and he opens up this section with the following quote. "The multitude of their actions affords so large a field that I were to blame if I should not by way of apology forewarn my reader that I have chosen rather to epitomize the most celebrated parts of their story than to insist at large on every particular circumstance of it." He also goes on to use the example of a artist, how they focus more on the face of their sculpture or their painting, in that they find it more important in rendering the image of that they're trying to portray. But either way, he continues on with this. He says, "I must be borne in mind that my design is not to write histories, but lives." So kind of continuing on the same line of thought is that, with these two individuals, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, there are hundreds and hundreds of books and histories on it, and it would take days and years, or a lifetime even, to fully understand them. But to focus on the parts that might actually affect your life would be the most fruitful. He also further says, "The most glorious exploits do not always furnish us with the clearest discoveries of virtue or vice in men. Sometimes a matter of less moment, an expression or a jest, informs us better of their character and inclinations than the most famous sieges, the greatest armaments, or bloodiest battles whatsoever." So, just further on that train of thought, that in this video, I'm not going to go too long talking about the wars and stuff, because it's not as politically relevant as much, but I'll be more focused on their actual character and who they were as a person, and perhaps how you can strive to their ideals that they laid out. And then lastly, if you've seen the previous video, and I already mentioned this quote, but I also like it as well. "It was for the sake of others that I first commenced writing biographies, but I find myself proceeding and attaching myself to it for my own. The virtues of these great men serving me as a sort of looking glass in which I see how to adjust and adorn my own life." So as I mentioned earlier, I hope that by watching these videos or by studying these lives that you start to embody some of their ideals and some of their virtues or even vices, because it's always best to strive for the highest ideal, and I think striving to be more like Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, for better or for worse, is a good place to aim. But either way, without further ado, let's begin with Alexander the Great. So, on his father's side, supposedly he was related to Hercules, and there's a lot of disagreements or a lot of myth surrounding his birth. Supposedly his mother, Olympias, had dreamed she was struck by a thunderbolt when he was being born. And throughout his life, it's either he slandered her or she claimed it. Many people thought he was a demigod or had some sort of Zeus, or likely it was Zeus, the king of the gods, the king of the Greek gods, was his father. This largely came across more as he achieved greater success, and it could have been something that he attributed to himself, but either way, the myth sort of stayed with him. His father had 7 wives, or even 8 perhaps. However, he married Olympias really quite young, so as such, Alexander was heir to the throne. It's said that his father had a dream that he sealed his wife's body with a seal of a lion. So sort of Alexander's symbol throughout, and a symbol for Caesar as well, is the symbol of a lion. And it's said that Alexander sort of had the temperament and sort of appeal of a lion, in that he had quite the temper, but he was also quite elegant as well. So, with that also, his father saw like a snake in his wife's bedroom and sort of assumed that she was having some kind of affair with a god or something. So even the father was somewhat convinced by this as well. But his birth coincided with the burning of the Temple of Artemis, which was one of the 7 great wonders of the world, and one later historian said that it was because Artemis was visiting Alexander's birth. So either way, it was very much celebrated, and there's a lot of myths surrounding it. When he was young, it said, or maybe to describe his appearance first, he had a crooked neck. It said his neck sat over his left shoulder a bit. There's a lot of myths saying that he had two different color eyes. I guess it's called heteromia iridum. But Plutarch doesn't note this, but he does note that he had a wandering eye, or a really appealing eye. It said that he was quite fair-skinned for the people there, except he had a more ruddy face, but otherwise he was quite fair-skinned, light-skinned, and he had supposedly the most agreeable odor that came from his skin and from his breath. And Plutarch notes or believes that it had to do something with his temperament, and he also says that all the great spices come from hot places, and for that reason, out of hot things yield concentrated goodness or power, and that's what he saw in Alexander. And it said this odor could even be found on his clothes or wherever he walked. So yeah, growing up, he had some of the best training ever because his father was king. He later gets the teacher of Aristotle, which I'll mention later, but he sort of disliked athletes because he thought that they should be fighting war or doing something more noble with their time. However, he did appreciate artists and did finance many of them throughout his life. While growing up, his father had some ambassadors from Persia, and he spent a lot of time with these ambassadors, entertaining them, but he proved, even while so young, that he asked many questions, but he was not very childish or asked trifling questions, and through that he learned a great deal about Persian culture and the geography of Persia that later led to his ultimate success. The Persian ambassadors saw within Alexander even a greater quality of character in Alexander than even his father. And his father was kind of questionable of this until later. There's this Thessalian gives this super strong horse to Philip as a gift, but none of the men can tame it, can ride it. And Alexander places a bet saying that he can do it. He says, "What an excellent horse do they lose for want of address and boldness to manage him." So basically saying you're wasting your time away by not being brave enough to go for it. And his father replied, "Do you reproach as though you know more than those older than you?" And he sort of says yes and makes a bet with him. And what he does with the horse is he realizes the horse, which he later calls Bucophales, which means ox head, probably has to do somewhat with the horse's temperament, was afraid of its own shadow. So he pointed the horse towards the sun until it calmed down and jumped up onto it. And he rode out into the distance and proved that he was the only one who was able to tame the horse. And with that, his father breaks out into tears, and everyone starts applauding, and his father really realizes how great his son is. And he has this statement: "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." So even by this point, and I think he was 16, oh no, he was 13 at this time, even his father realized that his son was going to surpass him and be super great. Alexander, amongst his friends, wished his father would not have success because he thought every success that his father had would eclipse his own abilities. So he wanted the less success that his father had, the more he could do. And he said that he would have rather inherited a poor and weak kingdom than a great kingdom. So he really very much loved glory more than anything else. So with this, his father really believes that he has to invest further in his son, and he calls upon Aristotle to train him at the academy. So it was kind of a school or a university, one of the first in history, and he gets trained by Aristotle. It's said by Plutarch that he learned even beyond the morals and politics that were commonly known amongst Aristotle, and he said the certain wisdom can only be shared in person. So he says that Alexander had certain wisdom from Aristotle that few others ever had. Alexander even gets upset with Aristotle for sharing and writing down his information with other people because he thought it was giving away his competitive advantage. But Aristotle thought it was fair to share some of his wisdom through writing. So not only was Alexander the most ambitious person in the land, he was probably one of the smartest as well. So at age 16, Philip goes away to wage war on Byzantium, and Alexander proves himself amongst the Greek people by putting down a Thracian revolt and colonizing territories. And he actually founds his first city, Alexandropolis, and he finds many other cities, most notably Alexandria in Egypt. But at this point, Philip even now realizes especially that he is more fit to be a general, while Alexander is more the king, because people are really starting to support him. But Philip falls in love with this new woman, Cleopatra, and Olympias, Alexander's mother, is really worried that Alexander will not get the throne because he is only half Macedonia, and Cleopatra's child would be fully Macedonian. So Alexander really reproaches his father and gets very upset with him. But ultimately, he has this other brother too that Philip tries marrying off, and Alexander reproaches his father for trying to, because once again, Olympias, who is his mother, but he was her only child, Philip's first wife, is worried that he would not get the throne. But Philip says that he had better plans for Alexander. So I think Philip was somewhat faithful to him the whole time. But at the age of 20, Philip is assassinated at his daughter Cleopatra's wedding, and by the captain of his bodyguards. But the captain of the bodyguards was also ultimately killed, but two of Alexander's companions were also killed. So this kind of leads me to think perhaps, or others to think that perhaps Alexander and Olympias were involved in some way in Philip's assassination, but it's hard to say. At one point prior to Philip's death, he throws while his father was at a drinking party, he was going to marry off one of his sons, one of Alexander's brother, to a great king, and Alexander defies him and throws a cup at this king's head, and Philip tries to actually kill Alexander but stumbles down on the ground, and Alexander really makes a fool of him in public. So they sort of had a falling out, but I think that Alexander still respected his father and really appreciated him, and I think there are many anecdotes and enough evidence to prove that Philip still had faith in Alexander and still wanted him to be king, because after Philip's assassination, he gets complete control of the kingdom. But he starts killing off some of his rivals. He burns some alive. Olympia actually burns some alive, and he gets upset with that. So I think a kind of common theme amongst Alexander is that he is harsh, but not overly harsh, and he knows when to kill and when not to kill. And he's also not particularly harsh against certain people, which we'll get to very soon. So with this, he wants to continue his father's legacy and start conquering Persia. So he goes on quite a conquest. He first starts in Upper or Asia Minor, it's called, and he expands down into Syria. He gets into Egypt and as far as India as well. With this, he ultimately starts adopting a lot of Persian customs, and he starts wearing Persian dress, and this really starts upsetting the Greek people. At one point, he threatens to allow Persians to join the military or become generals. So I think this is he really believed in amalgamation. He was not like an Adolf Hitler who wanted to spread his own gene pool, his own Greek gene pool, but rather he wanted to create an empire and really wanted to conquer and bring these people under his own banner, and he really wanted the best for them. even though he did commit a great deal of slaughters, he did want their best intentions, and he was not. It was not any sort of cultural genocide. It was perhaps genocides by necessity. There's another, and Plutarch starts discussing it now. A lot of people believe that Alexander was a severe alcoholic because on one occasion he kills one of his allies, Clytius the Black, who at one point saved his life for insulting his actions towards the Persians, where Alexander was being too nice to the Persians. But in Alexander's defense and by Plutarch, he notes that Alexander would not start drinking during the day. He filled his life with many hobbies. He did hunting, he did a lot of reading, and unlike many of the generals, he never missed his duty. And Plutarch says you can just look at his great success and kind of decide whether or not you can call him an alcoholic if he was so successful. It was said that he would eventually start eating very, very late, and he was very moderate in eating. He often gave the best fish and the best fruits to other people and left very little for himself. But when he did start eating, he would drink. But it's said that he just loved talking so much that he would get caught in discussions for so long and leave him getting ultimately quite drunk. It also might be because later, and we'll get to that, he ultimately dies drinking some wine, but I believe it was poison. So sure, he perhaps did drink a lot, but I don't think it was uncharacteristic of the time. And perhaps he could have even shown more moderation if he lived to be older, but he died very, very young in his 30s. So, yeah. Either way, I guess moving on to his death, he conquers so much of the land, and he wants to establish Babylon as the capital. And at one point, one of his greatest friends, Ephesus, dies and from assassination for sure, and he is drinking some wine, and he gets sick for 12 days. Plutarch says that it's unlikely that he was poisoned because the sickness lasted 10 or 11 to 14 days, which seems unlikely because most poisons didn't act. But some people have tried proving that certain poisons might act like this. But either way, he went through a period, he lost his voice and he couldn't really communicate, and he sort of just died at an extremely young age. But he managed to conquer pretty much the whole known world at the time, and probably, in my opinion, the greatest conqueror of all time. Yeah. So I guess we'll move on to Julius Caesar, then we'll go to the comparison. I guess I'll mention it now. The Plutarch actually doesn't have a comparison in his lives for Alexander and Caesar, so I'll just be making it up. Not making it up. I'll be filling the gap, I suppose. So, moving on to Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar, unlike Alexander the Great, he kind of had a more difficult upbringing. He was not a shining star in the sense, he came from a pretty politically influential family. He was married to Cinna's daughter. So Cinna was Marius's protege and probably one of the most powerful people from the Populares group. Also, Marius was his cousin, but obviously much older. But the reason this was so difficult was that after Marius and Cinna died, Sylla sort of starts massacring a lot of Populares and kills off many people in Marius's clan. The Populares were the people, like the populists call them, the more left-wing people, whereas the Optimates were more conservatives, more upper-class oligarchs, more right-wing sort. It's interesting how pretty much all these systems sort of have parallelisms, just like there's Republicans and Democrats. One is more right, one is more left. In ancient Athens, they had the Democrats and the oligarchs, and here in ancient Rome, they have the Optimates and Populares. So it's all just parallel. But either way, Sylla starts killing off a lot of people and really wants to kill even Caesar, but he ultimately gets away, and many people question Sylla why he wanted to kill Caesar so much, because Caesar was just a boy at the time. But he says that he sees more than one Marius in this boy, so Sylla could see the stark ambition in Caesar's blood. But either way, he spends much of his youth running away. He spends some time getting captured by pirates, and kind of indicative of his character, the pirates ask him for 20 talents in ransom, but he says that his life is so valuable, and he tells them that he's worth 50 instead. And they laugh at him, and they sort of... and then while he's there, he also tells them that he's going to crucify and kill them all. And they just sort of laugh at this young boy for being so naive. But he trains with them, and it was called the Cilicians, who were extremely bloodthirsty and extremely violent, but he would train with them. He would practice his oration skills and practice reading his speeches to them, and he would, if they didn't read them, he would criticize them for being idiots. He would, even when they were speaking, when he was trying to sleep, he would yell at them. So even when he was super young, he was very defiant, especially when he was captured by these pirates. But ultimately, when he does get freed, after raising the money, he does end up crucifying these people, staying true to his word, which really surprises these pirates. But he does give them mercy. He slits their throats first, supposedly, and then crucifies them. So he's true to his word, but I guess a little bit nicer than he could have been. But still, to crucify a dead body is still pretty horrible. So once he gets back, Sylla ultimately dies, and he has room to actually start climbing the political ladder. But before this, he wants to go to the school of Apollonius to practice his oration. And Plutarch notes that he was absolutely the second best, because he definitely could have been the best, and he worked extremely hard at being a great orator, but he was just so focused on war and so focused on tactics, where he knew that he couldn't be first place at both, and he dedicated more of his time to studying warfare. So ultimately, he does come to Rome, and he starts off as a legal career. Actually, his first role was as a sort of priest, as sponsored by Sina and Marius, but then he sort of starts making money through a legal career. But kind of throughout his whole life, he sort of battles by accumulating too much debt and by really not being very financially frugal, sort of like Scipio Africanus, who ultimately defeated Hannibal, kind of showing that you have to spend a lot of money to make greatness. But he was always battling with money, unlike Crassus or even Pompey, his ultimate rival. But Cicero was one of the greatest speakers of the time. When I look at his hair, which arranged with so much nicety, I cannot think that this man would ever conceive so great a crime as to overthrow the Roman constitution. So he was really sort of childish, boyish looking, but he ended up being extremely ambitious and took a lot more than anyone would have expected, except perhaps Sylla. So maybe Sylla ultimately should have killed him when he had the chance, but he didn't. The name Caesar actually supposedly comes from perhaps a Caesarian inception, or he could have been a killer of an elephant. This is obviously in his bloodline, not him personally, which supposedly he liked because he minted coins with elephants on them. It's also Oculus Caesaris. It could have been because he had grayish eyes, or it could have been because he had very thick hair, which also derives from the root Caesar. So there are many different reasons, but I think it's interesting that all these things could technically be true. Maybe he did come from a Caesarian fashion, had gray eyes, thick hair, and maybe someone slayed an elephant in his time. So maybe just assume they're all true. I think that's the best way of approaching history. This guy's already so great, it's not gonna hurt anybody if he's considered greater. But ultimately, he starts just climbing through the typical path towards consul or leader or military leader of Rome. He becomes tribune, he becomes quaestor, and while in quaestor in Spain, he sees a statue of Alexander the Great, and he's extremely humbled when he realizes how much Alexander had accomplished by his age, and he becomes both motivated and inspired by Alexander's actions. Both of them were very big fans of Homer and the Iliad particularly. That's where they derived a lot of their learning from. But in Caesar's case, I think he learned a lot, particularly from Alexander, so it's kind of cool. This video is sort of internally consistent in that regards. But yeah, he keeps climbing up through the ranks. He becomes aedile, and he gets sort of recognized for his lavishness. He always has an open house in his in his place, and he invites guests, and he always just spends a lot. And he's not as conservative. Even Crassus was the richest man in the land, but he was not as open with his money as Caesar. Because I think Caesar was never like Crassus, who was the richest man in Rome. He was never focused on money. He was focused on glory instead, which is very different and debatably, in my opinion, more worthy of pursuing ultimately. But going back to his religious roots, he gets elected as Pontifex Maximus, which is the high priest of Rome. Supposedly there was some bribery, but since he had this background being popular with the populares, I think he kind of got away with any sort of bribery or anything like that. He becomes praetor, and he gets a lot of esteem and a lot of fame in Hispania, which is now known as Spain, and he gets called imperator, which is essentially conqueror, or a very great title for a Roman. Crassus helps him with many of his debts, so throughout his career he is very indebted to Crassus, and Crassus was sort of having a conflict with Pompey, who is the other main leader then. As praetor, he wins a great success in Gaul, and he wants to throw a triumph, it's called, and Pompey had 3 triumphs where you essentially march the army into Rome and show off all your spoils of war. But it was decided that he could either run for consul or do his triumph. And I think, once again, very indicative of his character, he chose not to do the triumph, not to do the pomp and circumstance, but instead to focus on the ultimate goal, which is power. And he ran for consul, which he ultimately won, despite even Cato the Elder, who was known for being very moderate, even bribing people to not vote Caesar in. So a lot of people at this point really started suspecting that he was being a little bit overly ambitious. So he, fortunately for it's called the First Triumvirate, which is the ally between the 3 great men, Julia, his daughter, marries Pompey. Obviously Pompey was much older. Pompey was even older than Caesar, but he marries Julia, who is Cornelia's daughter, and Cornelia was Cinna's daughter, if you're following the lineage. So this kind of bridges the gap between Pompey and Caesar, and as well Crassus. So the triumvirate sort of makes temporary peace between the 3 most powerful people in Rome. He does a lot of measures of redistribution of lands for the poor, and he forces this by military action. Both Pompey and Crassus support this, but Pompey brings his army into Rome, which sort of really starts escalating things. But many people oppose this legislation for the redistribution of land, but Caesar really starts sort of foreshadowing his future ambition by forcing this legislation to go through. They said the Senate was comprised of Julius and Caesar, basically saying Julius Caesar ran the Senate at that point. Then he continues back into Gaul, and he just keeps getting extraordinary success, even though he did still have a lot of debt. He was in charge of 4 legions, which just kept expanding and kept getting stronger and stronger, and the people really started to respect him more than they respected Pompey, who, as he was getting older, sort of started getting more aligned with the Senate and the Optimates. I think most people in their lives, as they get older and older, they get more conservative and more right-wing. So at this point, Pompey was starting to look a bit old and sort of aligned with the wealthy and older people, whereas Caesar, who was much younger and who had done a great deal of legislation for the people and popular amongst the military, was starting to look like quite the threat. So they have what's called the Lucca Conference, where the 3 individuals meet up, and they decide that Caesar shall have control of the army in Gaul for 5 more years, while Pompey and Crassus could form government, consulship, which they probably thought was a good idea, would keep Caesar outside, and they kind of predicted that maybe he couldn't maintain this success for much longer. But despite this, he just kept getting stronger and stronger, and supposedly he fought 3 million men, slayed 1 million, and enslaved 1 million as well. So great deal of success. And even in this time, he invades Britain and Germany by crossing the Rhine, and two things that had never been accomplished by Rome before, and rarely ever in history. So great achievements by him, and proving him far eclipsing Pompey's abilities. With this, he even becomes more powerful, but unfortunately, Julia, Pompey's wife, dies, and Caesar's daughter, and this kind of breaks the connection between the two individuals. And Caesar even tries to make amends, and he offers his granddaughter to Pompey, but Pompey refuses it. So Pompey's made quite a few poor decisions here, and with that, the first triumvirate breaks, and he realizes that if he goes back to Rome, he would be persecuted. So, because Crassus eventually passes away, and Pompey pretty much had complete control of Rome, so he crosses the Rubicon, which is a very famous river, and he says the die is cast. So basically saying, let fate decide, and he invades Rome with one legion, the 13th Legion, which is the symbol of the lion, which I think is kind of representative of his character and as well of Alexander's character. So with the 13th Legion, even though Pompey vastly outnumbered him, there was a very poor morale in Rome, and probably even the military really wanted to support Julius anyways. So Pompey actually flees Rome, even though he probably could have won the fight, and so did all of his allies. And he gets chased all the way down to Egypt, where he is eventually assassinated. Caesar is actually very upset and breaks into tears when he finds out that he was assassinated, and he kills off the people who assassinated him. So Caesar was actually, even though he was the one who declared the war, Pompey pretty much burned every bridge in between. He could have married Caesar's daughter. He could have not ran from Spain, and he could have bridged the gap with Caesar in the Lucca Conference better as well. But either way, Caesar, since his old wife is dead, he falls in love with Cleopatra, which is a very famous story. But at the time, he was dictator of Rome because he had marched there, and he set Mark Antony in charge, who was sort of his right-hand man. And he falls in love with Cleopatra, but it wasn't considered adultery in Rome because she was from Egypt. So supposedly he had a daughter with her too. He slays King Pontus super swiftly, and this sort of undermines all of Pompey's wars, because Pompey had quite a bit of struggles fighting against Pontus, but Caesar defeated him super quickly, undermining all of Pompey's abilities. In this time, he is elected dictator once for an indefinite term. He becomes consul again, and then he gets elected consul for 10 years, dictator for 10 years. This is it was 49 BC when he crossed the Rubicon, and he ultimately dies in 44 BC. So it was only a 5-year period in between. But in this, he does a lot of changes and political reforms. Firstly, he suppresses all uprisings within Rome, so much stronger military control, which is probably the only it was definitely a far right-leaning action. He awarded money for people for large families because he wanted to repopulate Rome and Italy and create a lot more individuals. He outlawed professional guilds. So professional guilds were sort of like unions, but they were starting to get a lot of political power. So once again, unions are very left-wing policies, smaller government, bigger power in terms of the unions. So he suppressed that and increased centralized control. Very right-wing policy, very, very dictatorial. And with that, he does some debt restructuring, and he eliminates somehow 1/4 of all debts, which is something that I think modern-day countries should look into doing. And probably most famously, he adopts the former Egyptian calendar, which was based on the sun, which made things a lot easier for farmers to plan. And pretty much the calendar we have to this day is about the exact same. The only difference is a couple of the names. and the Senate was so pleased with his action they called him Father of the Fatherland, and they named the month July after him. So yeah, this calendar first started on January 1st on 45 BC, just prior to him dying. So, and we still have that calendar to the day, at least in Western culture, or in North America, or Canada, where I live. So, with that, he claims himself dictator for life because he wanted to go fight a war in the war that Crassus had died fighting, the Parthian Empire, and Crassus had failed that. But in leaving, he was worried that he might lose political control, so he grants himself dictator for life and powers to elect all government officials and all public offices, which is therefore extremely undemocratic in that the all elected officials represent him, not the people. So it was extremely a bad thing to do. So with that, the Senate decides that they want to assassinate him, and Mark Antony figures out, but he is captured before he could tell Caesar, and supposedly he sustained 60 people attacked him, most famously Brutus, but supposedly he got 23 stabbings, but maybe only one was fatal. I find that hard to believe. After 23 stabbings, how can most of them not be fatal? And he put up a big fight, but he's famous for this quote, which he probably never said in Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, "Et tu, Brute," which basically means that, "and you, Brutus," in that after his friend had betrayed him, he realized what he should do, and then he says, "and thus Caesar must die." So he realized that he had wronged the people, and he finally gives up. In Plutarch's account, he never says "Et tu, Brute," but upon seeing Brutus, he puts his tunic above his head and sort of gives up and says, "Okay, I admit defeat." So sort of a tragic death for him. With that, sort of when Alexander died, it sort of left his empire completely ruptured and without a leader. In Caesar's death, he granted all of his powers and will to Augustus, but there was another civil war which Augustus, or Octavius as he was formerly known, ultimately claims the throne or claims the empire for himself. Plutarch actually doesn't have a life on Augustus. Maybe I'll just discuss it anyways at one point, but either way, that is the life of Alexander and Caesar. Just for a quick comparison, even though Plutarch didn't write anything on it, Alexander was born in more favorable circumstances than Caesar, I would say, even though he probably he didn't want this. He wished himself to have the worst circumstances possible so that he could achieve the greatest amount of success, whereas Caesar was really kind of had to run from the state, got captured by pirates, and really had a much tougher upbringing. Both of them were, well, more so Alexander was a more amalgamating individual in that he wanted to bring the Persians under his banner and bring them in and unite the peoples, whereas Caesar sort of created a lot of political opponents, but also he wanted to more breeding in Italy, which I think of as a more divisive action. In terms of military endeavor, which Plutarch always discusses, I think they're both quite comparable. They were both undefeated on the battlefield. Caesar had some difficulties in Gaul, whereas Alexander was pretty much success after success after success, but perhaps Caesar was fighting more formidable opponents, so that could be a good defense in his regards. But either way, they were both as good as it gets in terms of warfare, maybe only comparable to Napoleon Bonaparte or Churchill or Adolf Hitler. Yeah, I guess that's the main things for their comparison. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch the next one. Thanks so much.